Today we are talking about the Super Mario Brothers movie, released in 2023. Hell yeah! So this was directed by Alan Horvath and Michael Jelenic, and it was written by Matthew Fogel. There's a great voice cast in this movie. Chris Pratt is in it, Anya Taylor-Joy, Charlie Day, Jack Black. I can't remember everyone else who's in it, but it's like a big, awesome voice cast, and it's a really fun movie. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the structure of the film. I've done other films with structural breakdowns in them where I talk really just kind of about the sequences, the act structure, some major plot points. I'm not going to get into A story versus B story, which is like plot and subplot. I'm not going to talk about character triangles. I'm not really going to talk about character arc or things of that nature. I'm just going to focus on kind of what is called the physical story, like the physical action of the story, and how the basic structure of the narrative breaks down. What I think is really interesting about the Super Mario Brothers and why I wanted to do this video in particular about this film is that the movie, it's playing into like a contemporary cultural zeitgeist moment in like American pop culture. And by playing into this kind of zeitgeist moment, it's actually challenging traditional cinematic narrative structure in ways that I think is actually kind of interesting. So I want to talk about that in particular. Now, that might make no sense at all in the abstract as I'm sitting here in my chair talking to you about it. So I'm going to walk you through the movie. I've got a bunch of screenshots, and I'll talk about what specifically I mean by that. As I say in every video, this is film theory, writing theory, cinema theory, whatever you would call it. It's not film fact. There are probably a lot of people out there who would disagree with me on where these plot points land and how the sequences break down in this film. And I invite people that, what's going on with my hair? Like, it's such a mess all the time. I invite people to disagree with me in the comments, and we can have some good-natured back and forth about that. Just to give you an idea of kind of my lineage as a student of cinematic narrative, I've talked about this before on the channel. My primary professor who taught cinematic narrative and structure to us in grad school, I have a graduate degree in screenwriting, was Beth Serlin. Beth Serlin went to USC, which is the University of Southern California, for film school, which is widely considered, as I've said before, one of the best film schools in the world. She had a classmate who wrote this book. His name is Paul Joseph Gulino. This book is called Screenwriting, the Sequence Approach. You can buy this at bookshop.org or your local bookstore or anywhere else that you buy books if you are interested in knowing the things I know and seeing kind of like where I'm coming from in discussing this. But I kind of come from like the USC lineage of cinematic structure, even though I did not go to USC because my professor went to USC. Something else that's worth noting in this film, or rather with regards to this film, is this is a very short movie. So the movie is 90 some odd minutes as listed online, but if you take off the credits of the film, it's 83 minutes. And if you take off the teaser, which is the opening scene, which I'm going to talk about in a minute here, which is not really part of the present tense story of the film, if you want to call it that, it kind of is. It sets up the world and stuff like that, but it's not really, if you chopped it off, it wouldn't change the narrative really. The events of the teaser figure very prominently into the narrative, but all the events in the teaser are revisited later in the film and discussed later in the film. So if you took the teaser off, it wouldn't really change the story of the film. And the teaser is, I wrote it down, 4.5 minutes. So you get like 78, 79 minutes of story in this film. This is a very short movie. And so when I talk about sequences in this film, some of them are actually just individual scenes that serve essentially as what would be a sequence in a longer film. A sequence being a series of scenes oriented around a goal. Sometimes there's just one scene oriented around what would be a sequence goal in a longer film. In this movie, just because it's so short. So let's jump into the movie and let's talk about Super Mario Brothers. So the reason I use this image here, even though it's I think this is just a promotional image. I don't think this is actually in the film. I might be wrong about that. If you look at the street, there's a street sign kind of like behind Mario in a diagonal. I think it says Brooklyn on it. So I guess they're on Brooklyn Street in Brooklyn, which is just a silly detail to me. All right, so let's get into this for real. So this is my very basic 3-act structural template that I came up with for doing these videos. You've seen this before if you've watched this channel before. This is very, very basic. I cannot emphasize that enough. It really just has 3 major plot points, and the sequence is broken down along with the acts of the film, Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. We start off with the opening sequence. We have the inciting incident. Then we have the second sequence of Act 1. That line there, after the inciting incident, is our break into Act 2. We have the first 2 sequences of Act 2. Then we have the midpoint. Then we have the second and third, excuse me, the third and the fourth sequence, the second half of Act Two, which are the third and the fourth sequences of Act Two, which are the fifth and the sixth sequences of the film as a whole. Then we break into the third act. We have the first sequence of Act Three. Then we have the third act twist, and then we have the final sequence of the film. So that's just kind of what I'm going to be talking about in this movie. So this movie opens with a teaser, and a teaser is basically a scene that sets up world, it sets up character, and it sets up kind of conflict and things that will play out over the course of the film. But that's exciting. It's got some kind of tension or violence or intrigue in it that captures the audience right away. And then we put you into kind of the present tense story, and you follow through that adventure until eventually it kind of reconnects to the teaser. So the teaser in this film is Bowser showing up where the penguins live and stealing the star from them and like destroying their castle and everything like that. And he's a very bad guy, and he has intentions of taking over this whole kind of magical world. And then we cut to what is essentially the status quo. So status quo is what you would call the first sequence of a film that establishes what is normal in the world of the film before the characters go on the journey of the film. Like, what is their normal life before something interrupts it and causes them to go on this journey of the film. So Mario and Luigi live in Brooklyn, and they're brothers, and mamma mia, they're Italian Americans, and they are starting their own plumbing business, and they make this commercial, which people are kind of making fun of, and they go out on some plumbing jobs. There's a very funny scene where they go on this plumbing job, and they get sabotaged by a dog who doesn't like them. It's very silly. And so that's kind of like the opening sequence of the film, really, is them trying to be entrepreneurs and having this plumbing business, and that establishes the status quo of their world and their family, their neighborhood, and stuff like that. Then we have the inciting incident. So as they are trying to prove themselves as plumbers, and if we go back to our structural breakdown here, you'll see the inciting incident is right there in the middle of Act 1. They're trying to prove themselves as plumbers, and there's this huge leak in Brooklyn, and Luigi is watching it on television, and Mario comes into his bedroom, into Luigi's bedroom, and he sees him watching it, and he's like, oh, we can go and stop this leak. Like, the plumbers, they can tell, I guess, by watching the television, like, the plumbers who are there on the scene are not even looking at the right thing. There's, like, water just exploding all over this street in Brooklyn, and Mario's like, those guys are total amateurs. They don't know what's actually the problem here, and we can go and we can fix this. So they go down into the sewers to try to fix this leak, and they end up finding this kind of strange pipe that doesn't make any sense. If you played the Mario Brothers video games, you know what these pipes are, right? So Luigi gets sucked into the pipe, and then Mario gets sucked into the pipe too. So the inciting incident to me is, I define the inciting incident as the thing that makes the second act inevitable, right? So somebody else, like the author of this book, for instance, might define it more along the lines of like, it is the thing that interrupts the status quo of the life of the character that eventually leads to them going on this journey. It's kind of just like different ways of saying the same thing in my mind. So the inciting incident to me of this film is when Mario and Luigi decide to go to the site of this plumbing disaster in downtown Brooklyn, because that's what leads them into the sewer, which leads them to the pipe. I said before that there are sequences in this film that are really just one scene. This is one of them. They go to the scene of this plumbing disaster. They go down into the sewer. They get sucked into this pipe, and that is the break into Act 2, really. So the second sequence of Act 1 in this film is really just one scene. But again, this is like a 79-minute movie if you take off the teaser. So you don't really have a lot of room in a film of that length to have longer sequences. So they get sucked into this pipe, and they're in this kind of magical stream that they're flying through. And the two of them get separated. So Luigi, as you can see here, goes off in one direction, and Mario goes off in the other direction. We stay primarily on Mario. So as the second act begins, Mario is the protagonist. So he's the character with the most active kind of goal and need and want. And I define the protagonist as the character whose actions and desires are essentially driving the second act of the film, which is typically what you think of as the plot of a movie if you're trying to like describe it to a friend or whatever, right? So Mario, in this case, the second act begins with Mario as the protagonist, and his goal is to find his brother and rescue him from this world because he's worried he's in danger. So that breaks us into the second act. So now we're on the first sequence of Act 2. So Mario meets up with Toadstool, and he tells him, like, I gotta find my brother, and Toadstool's like, oh, you should talk to Princess Peach, and like she can help you, whatever. So the Act 2 sequence 1, which is sequence 3 in the film, the goal of that sequence is for Mario to get to the palace, to get into the palace, and to meet Princess Peach so that she can help him on his larger Act 2 goal of finding his brother. So a sequence is essentially a group of scenes, or like I said, in this film, sometimes just an individual scene that is typically oriented towards a single goal that is a small piece of a larger goal of the act, especially in Act 2. So what happens next? He gets into the palace and he meets Princess Peach, but what we learn in the meantime is that Princess Peach has to... she's worried about Bowser. Bowser is coming towards her kingdom. She has to try to protect her kingdom, and she's trying to make a plan to protect her kingdom. So when Mario comes to her and he's like, you got to help me find my brother, she's like, that's not that important when I'm worried about my entire kingdom being destroyed. Now, when I talked about a zeitgeist moment that this movie, I think, is a part of, a pop culture zeitgeist moment, and how that challenges what you might think of as a traditional mainstream American Hollywood cinematic narrative, we're getting into what I'm talking about here. In a traditional mainstream Hollywood cinematic narrative, the female character, princess, in a film that is driven by male characters would typically be there primarily to support the male character, especially the white male character, in whatever their goal is, right? Because traditionally American Hollywood mainstream cinematic narrative is driven by male heroes, and especially white male heroes, right? In this movie, Princess Peach is given a lot of agency, right? Because now we're in this zeitgeist moment now where cinematic narratives are starting to consider the stories of people who were previously kind of relegated to supporting roles or not really considered heroes in, you know, the mainstream Hollywood system. So women, for instance, right? And so there's some interviews on the Blu-ray, which I have, where you can see the directors and the writer talking about how they wanted to make the female character more heroic and driving the story more and more a part of the central narrative, and not just this kind of figure who is there to support Mario, right? This starts to challenge what we think of as traditional cinematic narrative, because now we're in this position where the protagonist of the film, Mario, in achieving his goal of the first sequence of Act 2, which is sequence 3 in the film, he has come up against this situation where Princess Peach has a much more pressing goal. Her goal is far more urgent and important at a higher level if she needs to save an entire kingdom. He just needs to find his brother so they can go back to Brooklyn. So she tells him essentially, if I can use you in defeating Bowser, if you can go on this mission with me and help me, we can protect the entire world that we live in, and in doing that, we can then go and rescue your brother. But if Bowser destroys everything, your brother doesn't matter at all, because he's going to die along with everybody else, right? So her goal supersedes his. Then we get into the question of, okay, but who's the protagonist now? Which is really interesting, and I think almost kind of changes sequence to sequence, scene to scene. So she says, let's see what you're made of. So the next sequence in the film, and this is another sequence in this movie that's really just one scene, is a training sequence. Mario has to prove himself to Princess Peach in order for her to be willing to take him on this mission. So he's eating mushrooms and he's growing, and he's doing this like obstacle course. And if he can complete the obstacle course successfully and impress her with his abilities, then she will take him on this mission, right, to try to save the kingdom. And this is really the second sequence of Act 2, which would be the fourth sequence in the film. Now, I think you could argue that Mario is still the protagonist in this sequence, because he has the active goal of trying to prove himself to her so that he can go on this mission with her, with his end goal of saving his brother. But, as I said, interestingly, her goal is actually more important than his and kind of supersedes his. So now we get back into the basic three-act structure, and Mario, this is, again, I said this with The Matrix as well in terms of the midpoint. This is a movie with kind of a soft midpoint. It doesn't really have a hard midpoint in the way that some films like pivot around a midpoint. Raiders of the Lost Ark actually is another film that I did a structural breakdown of that has kind of a soft midpoint. The movie that comes to mind immediately for me every time I think about like a hard midpoint is the Star Trek reboot from I think 2008. That movie came out, maybe 2009. That movie really pivots around its midpoint. So if people are interested in me doing a structural breakdown of that film, please do let me know in the comments, and I can track down a copy of that movie and talk about it. This is kind of the midpoint here is essentially that Princess Peach is like, okay, you can go on my mission with me, and so in a way it's a solid midpoint because it's pivoting, right? So Mario is no longer looking for his brother actively, and he's no longer proving himself to Princess Peach. It's she has accepted him. They have, I guess, actually, now that the more I think about it, the more it is kind of a pretty solid midpoint, right? She has accepted him as a member of a team, and they together are going to go on this mission that's going to become the second half of Act 2. So the mission is they have to go to the Kong army, who's, Donkey Kong and all the apes, and they have to basically plead with them, convince them to join forces with Princess Peach's people to defeat Bowser, right? So in this scene, Princess Peach is very much the protagonist because she's a princess, and so she's the one who's addressing the king of the Kongs, and she has to convince him to lend his army to her, and so she's in the driver's seat, if you want to call it that, for this scene in this sequence. Now, what's really interesting is I think this sequence actually has split protagonists, and this is what I say. Like, they're really kind of challenging a traditional notion of cinematic narrative. Like, you could say that when he meets her, it becomes a co-protagonist film, almost like a buddy cop movie, right? But to me, it's really two separate protagonists who kind of take turns in the driver's seat, if you want to call it that. So what the King of the Kongs says, and I apologize, I can't remember this character's name off the top of my head. He says, if they make a deal, basically, if Mario can defeat Donkey Kong in combat in like the arena, then Princess Peach can take the army and go and fight Bowser. So now Mario becomes the protagonist of this scene because he has the active goal of having to defeat Donkey Kong. But that goal is oriented towards Princess Peach's goal, which, again, as I said, supersedes his goal. So if you've seen the movie, eventually what happens is Mario finds a mushroom and he turns into a cat, and then he's able to defeat Donkey Kong with his speed and his agility and stuff like that. And so Mario is successful in his goal in this sequence, and so they get the Kong army. They are driving back to Princess Peach's kingdom with the Kong army. Here you can see Mario, Princess Peach, and Donkey Kong. And they get attacked on the road by Bowser's army. So the goal of this sequence, which is the fourth sequence of Act 2, which is the sixth sequence of the movie as a whole, is to get back to Princess Peach's kingdom, to get away from Bowser's army, so that they can set up their defense against Bowser, so they can successfully defend Princess Peach's kingdom. So this plays into, obviously, the overall goal of Act 2, which has become Princess Peach's goal, with Mario helping her, but also in the back of his mind wanting to save Luigi, right? So what ends up happening in this sequence is that the road is collapsed. Princess Peach gets away. The Kong army is on the other side of the road as it collapses, so they do not get to her kingdom, so they are not going to be able to help her to fight Bowser. And Mario and Donkey Kong actually fall into the ocean, which is beneath the road. And so as we break into Act 3, Princess Peach has failed her goal of getting the army to protect her kingdom, and Mario has failed his goal of helping her so that she can help him. So it ends on kind of a dark note. And the goal of Act 3, interestingly, is actually kind of similar. It's basically, how can Princess Peach save her kingdom now that she doesn't have an army, right? So that's this slight alteration of the goal is no longer, I'm going to go and get this army and militarily protect my kingdom. It's, how can I save my kingdom now that I don't have an army? And so we break into Act 3 with this question, and Princess Peach agrees to marry Bowser. And so here she is in the wedding dress. And so her concession to his demand that she marry him is how she protects the kingdom. And so we see like the setup of the wedding and all of that. And then we get to the Act 3 twist, which you can see here is like the final plot point that I have on my basic 3-act structure diagram here. And so this is Bowser in Brooklyn. So what ends up happening is the third act twist in this movie is interesting because it's really like an entire scene of events. It's not like one thing. So we find out that Princess Peach had a secret plan the whole time to try to defeat Bowser at their wedding. So she eats this thing that gives her ice powers. It's funny because she kind of looks like Elsa. It's like she turns into Elsa in a way. She freezes Bowser, and she's trying to rescue a bunch of her people who've been captured by Bowser. And at that same time, essentially, Donkey Kong and Mario manage to make their way back to the Princess Peach Kingdom. Luigi is one of the prisoners of Bowser, so he's like, oh, there's Luigi. So everyone's goals kind of come together in this big scene where the heroes make this big effort to try to defeat the villain and rescue everybody. And they do manage to rescue people, but then what ends up happening is Bowser gets free, and Bowser follows Mario and Luigi back into their world, which is, I guess, essentially our world, the world of the humans, and there's this huge fight on the streets of Brooklyn. And then they end up defeating Bowser, and they shrink him down. If you've seen the movie, it's pretty funny. They shrink him and put him in this little glass jar, and he becomes a miniature Bowser, and they've got him contained. And basically all's well that ends well, and you essentially get this really interesting dovetailing of if you're looking at the world in which Mario is the protagonist, his goal to get Luigi, and Princess Peach's goal, if you're assuming her to be the protagonist, of protecting her kingdom, those goals kind of collide in the scene that contains the third act twist. And then the Bowser essentially throws down with them, and there's this huge final fight. And so everyone is trying to achieve their goals simultaneously: defeat Bowser, protect Brooklyn, get him out of the human world, defeat him to protect Princess Peach's kingdom, defeat him to protect Mario and Luigi, and all this stuff. So it's, even though it's a very simple, straightforward narrative, it's complicated in interesting, subtle ways, and it does a lot of interesting stuff with traditional notions of who is the narrative and who is driving the story. And because of that, I think it's a really interesting film, and it's a really interesting movie to break down and kind of look at the structure of and examine those elements. So that's the Super Mario Brothers movie. That's a pretty basic breakdown of the kind of structure of the movie in terms of sequences, acts, physical goals of the characters, and things like that. My name is Will. I hope you liked this video. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. Let me know what other movies you'd like me to do breakdowns of along these lines. I thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.